We can think of the cosmos as like a giant zoo of stars. And one thing we do with animals is to classify them, and that's really helped us understand them better, helped us to understand evolution and diversity within species. Well, we can do similar things with the stars. We can treat them like animals that we're classifying. And so, an open question in astronomy throughout the 1800s was, how do we classify them? Can we classify them? Are there ways to group the stars and make some sense out of what we see? Because then we have a little bit better understanding of how they work and what's out there. At first, it can seem really overwhelming because every direction you look, you see a different star. If there's a way to classify them, that helps us grasp what's in the cosmos a lot better. Now, one of the principal contributors to this was a woman by the name of Annie Cannon, and she came along and her job was to take these spectral images. So she was looking at the spectrum of a star and trying to sort out the pattern and to group them by commonalities within the spectrum, the light spectrum, looking at the absorption lines. Now, stars had a classification scheme. So there was some working classification scheme that grouped stars, and it used letters. So there were letters. So there were type A stars and type B stars and type C stars, and there was a logic to it. Well, what Annie Cannon figured out when she was looking at the spectrum of various stars is that the current classification scheme didn't really capture what was happening with the spectra. And she figured out what it was that made the stars, or made certain stars have similar spectra. And when she did that, she found that you needed to rearrange the letters of the classifications that existed and to order them in a specific way. And in this specific pattern, which I'll describe in a second, she found a way to fingerprint the stars. So looking at the spectral pattern is like looking at the fingerprint of a person. You can identify the person from their fingerprint. You can identify the type of star, explain a lot about what's going on by looking at its spectral lines. Okay, now when she did this, she oriented the letters, or arranged the letters, O, B, A, F, G, K, and M. And so, like I said, there was A, B, C, D, all the letters for the different classes. She found that some were overlapping, and so she combined them together. Others needed to be reordered. And when she did that, she ended up with the letters in this sequence: O, B, A, F, G, K, M. And next to each letter here, there's also a number next to it. We can mostly ignore that. The numbers indicate sub-classifications. We're just interested with the main classification for now. So just look at the letter O, B, A, F, G, K, M. And the type O stars all had patterns that looked like this. The type B had patterns that looked like this. And if you look from top to bottom, you can see that they're different. And so the star spectrum was, at the time, and still is, fairly easy to take. You look at the star's light, you spread out the light into, like through a prism or something called a diffraction grating, and you can see where the absorption lines are. Immediately looking at this, you can tell what the spectral type is. They're unique. Each of these horizontal spectra are different from the one above it. You can always find some differences in lines. Now, the next thing to do is to see why it is that there are these differences. So she first recognized that there's a whole lot of stars that have spectra that look exactly like this. There's a whole lot of stars that have spectra that look exactly like this. The next thing to do is to say, well, what is it that makes them have the same spectrum? What property of the star stands out? And the property is temperature. So spectral classification is ordering the stars by temperature. So the best way to classify stars is by their temperature, from hot to cool. And so the hot end of the spectral classes are the type O stars, and the cool end is the type M stars. You'll read about in the chapter that there are actually some cooler cooler temperature stars, and so there are a couple other classes that should go below here. Those are what are called brown dwarf stars, and you could debate whether or not they're real stars because they don't have nuclear fusion happening in the core like the type O through type M. So this is an aside, but you will read a little bit about that there are some other classes that are below the type M stars. For us, to keep things simple, I consider a star to be an object that has nuclear fusion happening in its core, and that gives us the stars from type O to type M. O being the hottest, M being the coolest, and their spectral lines change as you go from top to bottom. So then we can ask ourselves, well, why do the spectral lines change as you go from top to bottom? Are the stars made out of something different? Yes and no. Stars are made of hydrogen, primarily. Just like we saw with the sun, most stars are just like that. They're made of hydrogen primarily. They start out by burning hydrogen and making helium in their core. However, in the outer atmosphere of the star, there is other stuff, right? There's other stuff around. And the temperature of the star affects what else can be stable in the atmosphere of the star. And it's the atmosphere of the star that determines the spectral lines. So if you have a really, really, really hot star, there's not many atoms or molecules that just burst apart because the electrons can't stay attached to the atoms anymore, and the molecules can't stay together. So for very hot stars, you tend to see less spectral lines. So a type O star, there's not as many spectral lines because there's not as much stuff that can be stable in the atmosphere. Generally speaking, as you go to cooler and cooler stars, you start to see more and more lines because the cooler environments allow for more atoms and molecules to be there, which means there's more things that can absorb light, and then you get more spectral lines in the spectrum. Now there's some subtleties, like if you look in this region here, there were some lines here, and then they go away here, and they're still away, but then they come back. And so some complicated things are obviously happening as well. But at the most basic level, stars can be classified by their temperature. And as the temperature decreases, you generally get more absorption lines in the spectrum. And this is the fingerprint of the star. Astronomers now have, well, they're computers that will do it, but they can take the spectrum of a star and look at the pattern of absorption lines and immediately know exactly what the temperature of the star is, which is a pretty powerful thing. All right, now lastly on this, there's a table, and this is a table from the textbook, where you can relate the spectral classes OBAF, GKM to different properties. For instance, color, we've already talked about this, how the hottest stars are blue, the cooler stars are red, right? Because red is longer wavelength light, less energy. Blue is smaller wavelength light, higher energy. So it makes sense that the hotter stars would be bluer in color, the cooler stars would be redder in color. So going back to one of the images from the previous video, we can take a look at any one of these stars, find its spectrum, and its spectral lines would tell us exactly what its temperature is. But in general, its color tells us roughly what its temperature is. I know that this star is cooler than this star because it's more red. And then the temperature ranges are given here. So if you remember the sun's temperature, it's in this range here, which makes it a type G star. And you see some examples of the stars that fall in that category over here. And then there's some features of the spectral lines. And you'll notice that in the hot stars like type O, you have neutral ionized helium, hydrogen. So those are the smallest atoms that are there. But then when you get to type M stars, you have metals and molecular bands. So much more complicated things can exist in the cooler environment. All right, so one last thing on this, because I mentioned earlier in the previous video, Sirius and the sun. You'll see the sun is in this temperature range here. Right? Sirius is in this temperature range, much, much hotter. So as you might expect, when the star is hotter, it's also brighter. And so it shouldn't be that surprising that Sirius, being a much hotter star, would be a much brighter star. Now that's not universally going to be true, that hotter stars are brighter. We'll talk about that more when we get into this evolution of stars. But for the most part, it is true that when you get increases in temperature, the stars generally get brighter. However, there are some complexities to that, so it's not universally true. And I'll give you one more example to that. The star Betelgeuse, which is part of Orion, is much cooler than the sun, but is actually much, much brighter. And the distinguishing feature is the size of the star. So the temperature tells us a lot, but it doesn't actually tell us how big the star is. It tells us how hot it is, but not how big. And it turns out Betelgeuse is much, much bigger than the sun. So even though it's not quite as hot, it actually outputs more energy than the sun does. Its luminosity is much higher. So we have a foundation for understanding the stars, and there's added complexity that we'll bring to it as we learn about more different types of stars, and then we'll begin to wrap it all together and see how all the different properties of the stars are interrelated and what affects what other property. So we'll do that going forward.